So some of you might be wondering who I am and why I'm moderating this panel. It's a good question. I'm honored to be here. I host a program, national radio program on Sirius XM that deals with basically public interest. We talk a lot about education. We talk a lot about violence. We talk a lot about race. We take it all head on. And I ask smart people like Jim some pretty decent questions. So that's why I'm here. I'm excited and honored and privileged to be here moderating this and excited to hear questions from you. So as we have a conversation, we'll turn it over at some point pretty quickly to you guys. But before we even do anything and start the conversation, Jim, I wanted to show this video that I found at whitehouse.gov. If you haven't visited that website, there's some stuff there. Let's take this is just a summary of video. It's about 2 minutes long, shortly after the president made his speech in late February.
I first met Christian about a year ago. I visited the Hyde Park Academy in Chicago, which is only about a mile from my house. And Christian was part of this program called Becoming a Man. And it helps young men who show a lot of potential but may have gotten in some trouble to stay on the right path. They get help with schoolwork, but they also learn life skills. And it works.
When he came into our BAM circle, it was one of the greatest experiences of my life. Most people do not get to meet him, or if they do, it's just a handshake. He sat down with us and shared his story. And to my surprise, he was just like me, growing up without a father, and sometimes not too concerned with school.
I could see myself in these young men. And the only difference is that I grew up in an environment that was a little bit more forgiving. I told these young men my story then, and I repeat it now because I firmly believe that every child deserves the same chances that I had. And that's why we're here today. I'm going to pen this presidential memorandum to determine what we can do right now to improve the odds for boys and young men of color. And we're committed to building on what works. And we call it My Brother's Keeper.
President Obama decided to get the private sector, the public sector, these foundations, all these great individuals, entrepreneurs, get them all involved to make sure that we can have these young men go on and be successful in life. And this one here is really key for America, not just the black and brown community, but for America. It will improve America.
It's important to have resources and programs like this because it will help younger kids to motivate them. Like if they're failing grades, just to keep trying and just pursue your dreams and never give up.
The community is not always that bad. It's bad because people get shot and killed. And that's all that you hear about it, but you really don't hear about YG or BAM because it's low cap, you know, it's not publicized like, oh, it's a big thing. But now what Barack Obama's doing with My Brother's Initiative is blowing that up, said it is some good coming out of the south side of Chicago.
So when I was selected to moderate this panel, I immediately went and watched, listened to the president's whole speech. And as soon as the Aspen Institute called me and said, would you be interested in doing this? I said, well, first I have to watch the president's speech. And instead of watching it, I just listened to it, and I was mowing my lawn. And I want to read a passage. There's a reason for it, for why I bring that up. I want to read a passage from the president's speech because there's one thing he said that made me, and right now I get a little chilled and emotional, that made me stop what I was doing and just kind of gasp, and I want to read that to you. This is from the president's speech. He said, as a black student, you're far less likely than a white student to be able to read proficiently by the time you're in 4th grade. By the time you reach high school, you're far more likely to have been suspended or expelled. There's a higher chance you end up in the criminal justice system and a far higher chance that you're a victim of a violent crime. Fewer young black and Latino men participate in the labor force compared to young white men, and all of this translates into higher unemployment rates and poverty rates as adults. And this is where he gets me. And the worst part is we've become numb to these statistics. We're not surprised by them. We take them as the norm. We just assume this is an inevitable part of American life instead of the outrage that it is. That's how we think about it. It's like a cultural backdrop for us in movies and television. We just assume, of course, it's going to be like that. Of course it's going to be like that. But these statistics should break our hearts, and they should compel us to act, which is the reason why I'm here and honored to be talking to you, Jim, because everybody here and listening and watching at home has to act. The name of my show is Stand Up, and I hope that the part of this conversation today, what you can do, is what resonates. So, I'll start with a tough question. Why this term? Why not the first 4 years? He got a lot of criticism that he didn't address these issues. Some of it was fair, some of it was unfair. It's never too late, in my opinion, but why didn't we talk about this the first 4 years?
So the interesting thing is that I think that what people miss is that the broader agenda that President Obama has taken on around opportunity is one that has broad benefit exactly for this population as well. It just happens that he started with the broadest possible lens, which is how do you create ladders of opportunity all across America? When you say, one of the programs that I started at the Department of Education was the Promised Neighborhoods program. People know Harlem Children's Zone and Jeff Canada. Promised Neighborhoods is basically how do you take that kind of intensive work to scale. Early learning all the way up to kids getting out. And the way you take that to scale is universal pre-K. The President's been trying to do that for a while. But also healthcare. Also broad-scale education reform. These are the things that are the pillars of providing opportunity for Americans. But what we realize is that we have a set of universal goals for our young people, that they'll enter school ready, that they'll be able to read by 3rd grade, that they'll be able to graduate from high school ready for college, that they'll go to college and they'll get trained for a job that'll get them a family wage job, and then all along the way that they're not going to get involved in the crime and they're not going to get hurt or shot. Like, these are the things that we want for America. That's where we started our work. And now we're saying, okay, now we need more targeted strategies because as America has benefited and we've made economic progress and people have gotten jobs, we still are seeing these gaps persist.
You know, you mentioned the Affordable Care Act, and I think that let's not just gloss over that, because that was a huge thing for lower income Americans who are disproportionately people of color. Talk about how Obamacare has extended health insurance to those people, because we forget how important that is, but people are benefiting from it every day in many states.
Well, I mean, let me give you a classic example of how it's going to play out specifically in this initiative. So what many people may not know, UCLA did a study and they found out that 95% of low-income kids who need glasses will not have them by the time they get to 2nd grade. Okay?
It's a tough statistic to hear in Aspen.
Right.
Knowing how much we could provide.
Now, put that together with another study that they did that said that 25% of the students that are entering special education, guess what they need? Okay, so now you say that in our work in education, there is no low-hanging fruit. Like, it is hard work to get student achievement to go up. But glasses? Like, glasses? Really? We should be able to do this. Now, the good news is that with the Affordable Care Act, with the insurance programs that we have now, low-income kids can get screened and get their glasses in most states, some states not, most states absolutely free. And in fact, there's a nonprofit that has taken that, figured out how to actually work with the insurance, with the state insurance, the federal insurance, got in a van, put ophthalmologists on the van. They do the screenings right there at the school. They use telemedicine to identify kids that have extreme needs for their eyes. They batch those up and send those off to a set of doctors that do screenings, and they send them in for surgery if they need to. And so in that way, they're actually impacting whole schools in weeks. And they have seen now, I won't blow their story, but there'll be a good study coming out later this year.
The president made, were you finished? I'm sorry.
Yeah, go.
The president made this speech at the end of February, right? February 27th. And then you had a 90-day period where you headed this task force, and you've got the report out after 90 days. Tell us what you've learned so far and that you reported it to the president, right?
Yeah. So 90 days we were supposed to come back with, first of all, let me just back up just for a second. President tasked us with a couple of things. The first thing is he launched the interagency task force across the federal government to have us say, what are the things that we can actually do to improve outcomes for this population, and what can we move out of the way that's impeding progress for this population? The second thing he did was he challenged folks on the outside in the private sector, many of whom frankly have been involved in this work for years, to say, what can you do in parallel as well? And we want to have a very specific philosophy, and you heard him say it in the speech, which is, we know that there are things out there that are working. What are they, and how we help them expand? So what we did is we took a cradle to college and career framework again, took those same 6 milestones that I talked about and said, in each one of those areas, what are the things that we can do as we looked across 18 agencies? And let me give you an example of some of the recommendations in there. So there's one about universal screening for health and behavior and making that something that every kid gets, in particular because we know that low-income kids and kids of color are not likely to get it. It will have a huge and disproportionate impact, positive impact on boys and men of color. I can go up the spectrum to suspensions and expulsions. So the Department of Education already does this collection called the Civil Rights Data Collection. It's now universal. It goes to every school in the country. Turns out when you look at that data, there are huge disparities on suspension and expulsion. It also turns out, though, that what we know is that when we highlighted this work in California, matter of fact, many of you may have seen that John Deasy, the superintendent in LA, was here, and the superintendent in Oakland at the time was also very progressive. They were confronted with this data that said that they were suspending and expelling black and brown kids at multiples of the rate of white kids in their communities. Instead of running away and defending themselves and lawyering up, what they said is, okay, let's figure out how to deal with this. And this is where I think the best of this model comes out. So then the California Endowment jumps in and other national foundations jump in as well. And they say, okay, we're going to help you find evidence-based practices for how you're going to improve your suspension and expulsion rates. And in fact, they did. And within 2 years, LA and Oakland have reduced their suspension rates by 50% among African Americans. Okay? The state of California, because this foundation not only focused on the programmatic work in those districts, but did advocacy work across the state, had policies that got passed across the state, and now the state is down 12% across the state. Okay, so many people are saying, okay, yeah, you kept those bad kids in. What happened to the rest of the school? Conditions in the school and the climate in the school and the culture in the school has improved. And guess what? They're about to finish up with a study this year and scores are improving as well.
Well, what happens, well, I think we know it happens, and it's just worth mentioning that Trayvon Martin was killed while he was suspended from school. What happens when kids get suspended?
So, I mean,
why is that such an issue?
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the ways to think about what has happened here, a lot of times people may not remember that the way this all got started was right after the George Zimmerman verdict, the president went into the press room kind of unexpectedly, and he made very eloquently talked about the need for the country to show these young men that we care about them and that we're willing to invest in them. And then he came out of that room and he looked at the people around and he said, I don't want those to be just words. We have to actually do something. And so we oftentimes enter these conversations from that point of tragedy. Some young man dies. We all of a sudden look at the data again around incarceration. We realize how many of our young people are locked up. And the question is, so then what do you do about it? And the reality is that what you see at that point is symptomatic of failure all along the way. Suspensions and expulsions, what winds up happening is that becomes one of the fastest pathways to the prison pipeline. We know that most of the kids that are incarcerated have not finished school. We know that, in fact, when you go to many urban districts, what you find is the primary source of juvenile arrests is referral from school. And so what winds up happening is that for lots of reasons that seem to make sense at the time, school gets violent, you're trying to calm down the environment, you put school resource officers in, you set up more strict discipline policies, you do zero tolerance policies, all to keep everyone safe, and then all of a sudden, the cycle kicks in. And you've got officers in the school who are trained on the street, not trained to do youth work with people. Very well intentioned, but not trained well to do work with young people. And so all of a sudden, these behaviors that used to send you to the principal's office now send you to prison. And so what we see is this dramatic climb of young people. They call it the school to prison pipeline for a reason.
250 years of slavery, 90 years of Jim Crow, 60 years of separate but equal, 35 years of racist housing policy. I mean, most of us know the record, but you know, I grew up in an all-white area, moved to New York City, started learning, started having my mind open, started reading more, but reading Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow changed the way I think about America, changed the way I think about history. It's probably the most important book written in a decade on these issues. And you know, I've got to ask you, I've got to put you on the spot and talk about drug policy because, sure, you know, we also know that blacks and whites are equally likely to smoke marijuana, according to surveys, but blacks are four times more likely to be arrested and jailed on marijuana charges. So we can't ignore that statistic when we're talking about my brother's keeper. And if I'm going to stand up and volunteer and be a big brother or a mentor, that's going to be an issue that's going to come up. It's going to be obvious. It's everywhere.
So the criminal justice set of recommendations are really clear about this. You know, obviously the first thing you want to do is find ways to actually keep people from getting to the point of sentencing. How do you keep them from being arrested? How do you create the context for the police to work more harmoniously with folks in the community? How do you actually train officers that are going to be working on the street about implicit bias? Frankly, how do you teach citizens about that? And I'll come back to that because people will automatically assume that this is like a white people versus the people of color thing. And that's not where we are anymore. But anyway, the laws that we've put in place, the way they play out in courts and justice, the way they play out with juries, results in disproportionate sentencing for almost assuredly when a person, especially a male of color, hits the courts. So the first thing we have to do is try and keep them out of there. And then when we get them there, we've got to pay really, really close attention to how we're actually feeding into the prison system and the prison industry by setting up these rules that mean that judges have no choice or discretion anymore around their sentencing guidelines.
The other issue when we're talking about incarceration, I can't help but bring up the for-profit prison industry, which seems just about the most immoral way to make money in America. I'm not sure that I've heard the president come out and say anything about that, but the idea that there's an incentive to lock young people up disproportionately of color is just about as backwards of an idea that I've heard in America, and there's some pretty bad ones.
So I mean, that complex exists. And one of the things that people always like, well, what role does government have to play? I was listening to a guy the other day say, oh, we've had this explosion of innovation in health, and it's all about the innovation in the private sector and what they figured out. And I'm like, there was this like investment in health IT, and there are these new incentives for actually producing better outcomes. So again, we have to figure out how we actually create the incentive structure if we're going to have this complex, so that people actually get paid for doing the right thing. You don't get paid for keeping people coming back. You get paid for having people who don't come back. And you get incentives for the longer they stay out. If they do come back, the longer they stay out, the better a job you did. That will change the industry. That will change the sector. That will align incentives. We may revert back to a publicly run system. I think there's a long road there. But I do think that it's very easy for us to think about how we align the incentives for these industries so that they're incented to do the right things. Same way we can do in higher education. We have a great incentive system for people getting into college, not a great incentive system for getting them out. These are the things that we need to think about when people say, what can government do? Like, a lot of what we do is set the rules of the game.
Well, we also have an incentive system in our campaign finance. Lawrence Lustig gave a speech here this week and got a standing ovation, which is not something you often see at Aspen. And Senator Chuck Schumer, a Democrat, takes quite a lot, at least $10,000 one year for the for-profit prison industry. I digress. I'm sorry. That's my issue that I worry so much about. Now, My Brother's Keeper is more of an initiative that is public-private. It's trying to create incentives and fund so many of these amazing organizations that understand what the problems are. Yeah. But what about laws? What about legislation? I mean, we know that it's very, very difficult for the president to do anything, even if it's a Republican idea. But there are laws, you know, like first-time offenses. They come out of prison and they can't even qualify for housing. They can't qualify for food stamps. And so they're damned if they do, damned if they don't, either way. And that, again, disproportionately affects men of color. So the good news is that there are a lot of things that are happening that are actually under regulatory authority. They are administrative provisions. Some of them, for example, housing regulations. Public housing authorities actually have fairly broad discretion over what they decide to do and what they don't decide to do with regard to folks with criminal records. It's a complicated issue, but they do have that flexibility. Turns out employers, like, there's nobody who's making employers have a box on their applications that before you even can apply for the job screens you out from being eligible. Employers, and many actually large employers, have already made the decision that that is not predeterminative. So they've taken it off the first application, let you get in the process, and then if it comes up, they have actually got enough information to make a decision. So there are things both in the private sector and the public sector that we can do to actually change it. Let me give you some examples of what we can do, though. It is already the law that if you have a juvenile facility that incarcerates young people, you still maintain the responsibility to provide them with a quality education. Like, that is the law of the land. And in fact, many, if I will say most, and in fact some most egregiously, provide no educational benefit to the young people in their care. And that is something we can actually do something about. In fact, our Civil Rights Enforcement Authority there is very, very strong. And we've used it a couple of times. I wouldn't be surprised if we use it a little bit more. It may not be called My Brother's Keeper, but
there'll be some boys of color who benefit.
My Brother's Keeper talks a lot about opportunity, and then we all know that's what this is about. We know that if you're born in certain zip codes, you're just not as likely to have the kind of opportunity. And I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with black folks, specifically black men, that talk about when I was growing up, the opportunity that I saw, the guy who was successful was the guy who was dealing drugs. That was the opportunity I saw. And if that's the way to make money, to get out, then we're in trouble. So how can what are some of the ways that we're working to create more opportunities? I know obviously talking about raising the minimum wage, and that seems like it's stagnated obviously because of the partisanship in America that we didn't used to have on that issue as much. But what are some of these opportunities that we're trying to create so that young boys and men have more options?
So very clearly, the big job of the administration for the last 5, almost 6 years now has been creating jobs. What we're now actually seeing is that we got the adults flowing back into the system, but young people are not, especially young people of color, low-income kids in general. What we've tried to do is work with the private sector, and we're seeing more and more people take this lens, where in fact the Center for Community Solutions is leaning on this a lot, which is that these organizations are great platforms for these entry-level positions, whether it's summer jobs, whether it's internships, whether it's apprenticeships, whatever those things are, the enterprise can create opportunity for themselves because they're always hungry for great employees, and opportunity for young people by changing the way they think about where they find talent. And so what we're seeing is that even though we've not been able to get additional funding from Congress to support the summer youth employment programs and things like that we like to do, what we're seeing is working with employers, them changing the way they think about employing folks and creating real opportunity for jobs. We're seeing cities take on, mayors in particular, taking on the role of being the chief job collector in chief for their young people. And in Chicago, I'll give a great example where now Secretary of Commerce Penny Pritzker identified some of the most at-risk youth, in particular those, because they have the data, you can see who's likely to be vulnerable to either being a shooter or being shot. And in that data, you can see that, and then you say, okay, well, let's give them something else to do. And when you do that, guess what? The numbers drop. Surprise, surprise. So let me say two quick things that seem a little bit tangential. The first thing is, after going into this work, entering it for the way we always enter it, through tragedy, I ended the 90-day period feeling incredibly optimistic. And there were 2 reasons that I felt incredibly optimistic. The first is we did these listening sessions all across the country, and they all started with young men, boys and young men telling their stories. And I always call them the roses in the concrete stories, because they are, will tell you about the dire circumstances from which they've come, and then they will tell you what they're doing in school. They'll tell you how they're going to college. They'll tell you how they're working and going to school. They'll tell you about what they're doing in their communities. And you go, okay. So while we have this national narrative about the plight and the troubles of boys and men of color, we have these incredible treasures of young men that are out there doing fantastic things. We just don't have enough of them. The second thing is that all across the country, wherever you go, there are people doing things that work. They're doing things that are changing young people's lives at every step of the way. The problem that we have, like we always have had in education, is that we do not take those things to scale. And this is an opportunity for us to do what we've needed to do all along, but by bringing folks together who have not been willing to come together before, really change the landscape for not only this vulnerable population, but all vulnerable populations. Now, the reason I talk about that in this particular moment is that you talked about the need for young people to be able to see something different. And one of the first things the president did when we gave him the report is the first action he took was to make a national call of action around mentoring. And there were a bunch of people who said, like mentoring? Like, that's your response to this national challenge? Like, but name a young person who's successful, forget their circumstance, who when you ask them what happened doesn't credit a person who intervened in their life. And so these boys are not like any other. They are in many ways the same, that if we want them to be able to succeed, we have to put people in their lives who not only are going to make the investment in them, but have the resources and the information to help them as well. People who have resources get that for their kids. We need to do it for the people who don't as well. Anyway.
One of the controversies about this initiative, I mean, it's interesting because I always say on the radio, if we could only agree on what the problem is, we could then have disagreements on what the solutions are. And it seems that while there's a lot of amazing organizations and individuals that can agree on what the problem is, some of them at least aren't sure about this solution. My brother's keeper. Sure. Why not my sister's keeper? So you know about this. You dealt with this even before the announcement was made. And there's been a lot of different letter writing campaigns, but more than 200 black men signed a letter expressing concerns about this initiative. I just want to read one paragraph and allow you to acknowledge it. If the denunciation of male privilege, sexism, and rape culture is not at the center of our quest for racial justice, then we have endorsed a position of benign neglect towards the challenges that girls and women face that undermine their well-being and the well-being of the community as a whole. As black men, we believe if the nation chooses to save only black males from a house on fire, we have all walked away from a set of problems that we'll be compelled to return to when we finally realize the raging fires consumed the black women and girls we left behind.
Very compelling language. First of all, I'm always disturbed when people feel the need to frame things as zero-sum. That when you are for something, you must therefore be against something. That because you decided to focus and drive a particular issue because of a specific need, that in fact you've made a conscious decision, I don't care about those people, I don't care about those issues. I mean, if it were not gender-based, if it were only race-based, then white people could make the same argument, well, why don't you care about white people anymore? I mean, it would be the same legitimate argument. And then what we're saying is, when you follow the data, it doesn't matter what you look at, early reading, but especially the ones, death, 6% of the population, 43% of murders in this country. Incarceration, black boys, 31 times more likely to be incarcerated than black girls, right? So it doesn't matter what statistic you look at, it is clear that we have a crisis in this community. And then to be honest, when I go in the community, I don't hear this conversation. Because if you go in the community, if you go to a graduation in the inner city, you look at the graduating class, you know that this is a problem. Because you are looking for the boys. You are looking for them. You go to an HBCU graduation, historically black college graduation, you are looking for the boys. And it's true whether you're talking about black boys, whether you're talking about brown boys, whether you're talking about Hmong children, Native American statistics for their males mirror black males. So I understand, and we do need to do things for girls of color. Their numbers are not much better, but just doing this is not a reason to say that doing this is not anything that takes away from that. In fact, the first thing that the president did when he came in was pass the Ledbetter and set up the Council on Women and Girls. Like those were literally in the first months of the administration, led by Valerie Jarrett and Tina Chin.
At the speech, he made a funny comment because anytime you can get Al Sharpton and Bill O'Reilly in the same room, you know you're making some progress. And he has Magic Johnson, as you saw in that video. What responsibility, do these role models, athletes, commentators, actors have, and how much of it are you enlisting them in it?
So the outpouring of support from those folks has been fantastic. The Magics of the world and others, they've been willing to use their voice on this. We have not really mobilized them yet, I will say, because what we wanted to do is make sure that what we put them against is very strong. The thing that I'm actually most compelled about is these folks who people have no idea who they are, right? This guy named David Drummond. People know who David Drummond is? So David Drummond is the general counsel at Google. He also happens to be a black guy. And I can tell you, I can walk through 100 rooms with black people in them and I will find 5 people who know that's the case. And so there is this opportunity to put in front of our young men a bunch of brothers that they should know, that they don't. They all know Magic. They don't know about these other guys, and they are all over the place. And so, these folks have been great. They're putting their resources on the table, both in local communities and nationally. They're willing to use their voices and their celebrity to help drive the work. But the other thing we're trying to do is to tap into all the other folks that can actually be role models, can be mentors, and actually at the local level have the ability to drive the work, because that's where it's going to get done. Like, we'll create a national umbrella, we'll create some attention when we come to town, but what is going to happen for this work to continue is that local communities are going to have to organize programs that work, like the one I just heard about in Kansas City, are going to have to get expanded. Those are the things that are going to allow us to make real impact in real kids' lives.
We'll go to questions. That's the microphone we're using, right? Can we just step up to this microphone, and I'll ask my last question, and as soon as he's done, Jim is done, we'll go right to it. Go ahead, sir. So, yeah, to form a quick line. So, $200 million right now invested by all these different private organizations. What's next?
So what's interesting is the foundation is committed that they're going to invest $200 million. They now put out a paper telling the areas where they're going to invest it. They are now in the process of deciding where the $200 million is going to go. There's a big emphasis on setting up place-based work that specifically takes on that cradle to college and career framework. There's a specific amount of resources that are going to be put directly behind the notion of suspensions and expulsions because we know now that we can actually move the needle, and so why not take that work national? There's specific work that's going to go around the criminal justice stuff that we talked about. So excited to see where that $200 million actually lands and the impact that it has. What it's starting to do is to catalyze other resources, and both monetary and non-monetary. We're seeing folks mobilize around both the call to action and put resources in. And so let me give you an example. What we're seeing in I guess they haven't announced it yet, so I won't name the city, but there is a community foundation that has already made a commitment where they are going to set up this, again, data from birth all the way through college and into career. They're building that data infrastructure for the school system, to link the school system with the children and family services system, with higher education and the workforce development system. They have identified a university partner to work with them to identify the programs that have the most efficacy in their community. And then they are recruiting their friends and others to put together a $100 million pool to invest in the programs that are most effective to take them to scale. And I expect to see that kind of work happening in communities across the country, not necessarily at that scale because not every community has access to $100 million, but that kind of organization, both blending public and private, is what I expect to see.
Just your first name?
Bill Oberndorf, and I have worked for 23 years on K-12 education reform nationally. 90% of the dollars spent on K-12 are in our states. Only 10% is federal. And today, we have some striking examples of broad systemic reform in states. If you take a state like Florida, where you had a failing public school program, if it failed, you had to be reconstituted. You had charters and you had private school choice. Minority kids perform at the same level on the NAEP as white kids do in the state of Florida. The same things that happened in Florida, Governor Daniels did in Indiana. We saw a huge jump in the NAEP scores, even though we only have 3 years of that. We have 15 years of history in a city like Milwaukee, where 30% of the kids go to charters, 20% go to private schools, 50% go to public schools, and the graduation rate's gone from 45% to 80%. Those are big, broad, systemic reforms. And I would suggest, and I'd like to know your view on why not, this is what works. We also have 500,000 empty Catholic school seats in urban America, and because we don't have school choice, those schools are empty, and they've worked well for 100 years.
So you clearly have a perspective on what works, and so here's what I'll say. Great examples. Many of the things that you talked about are absolutely true. I could also point at Massachusetts and New Jersey. New Jersey has the highest NAEP scores for Black African Americans in the country. Massachusetts, you know what their performance is on the national assessments, especially for kids of color. Washington, D.C. had the highest growth rates. So I can go on and on about different people that are taking different approaches to getting the same kinds of outcomes. I believe that we need to be taking a hard look at all of them, and for states that actually set high standards and use a systemic strategy for a long period of time, I think that is, with things that are demonstrated to work, whichever one they choose, we're all in favor of. What we are seeing is that, and so that's why we tried to create the context for states to do that. Like the interesting, you asked what happened during the first term. The race to the top, people often talk about it as prescriptive. What it said is, set goals that matter, use data to tell you whether you're making progress or not, set your incentive structure so that what happens with kids learning actually matters, and deal with your worst performers. And in that context, 50 different states set out their own plans for how they did it, including Florida, including like the ones that you named. So yes, Charters and Choice have been a part of many states' success stories. It's not been a success part of this, the success story of everyone. Vouchers have been a part of the success story. In most places, they don't have sufficient scale to actually say that they actually have a huge impact on the overall population. But what we need to do is to figure out how all of these things play together to drive the outcomes that we're looking for.
And I would suggest we focus on those, what is only a handful of states today. It is not a long list. And let's understand it, because I think that is replicable and scalable. Thank you.
We agree.
Hi.
Hey.
I'm Brenda Manuel, and I'm from the Los Angeles Unified School District. You know, I have a concern, and I appreciate with My Brother's Keeper that you went around and you solicited student voice. And I think that until we start really engaging our students to help us with some of these issues, that we're not going to find some of those great solutions. So I don't have a question, but in LA Unified, we started a unit called the Student Involvement Development Empowerment Unit. Yep. And I'm encouraging you to get other school districts to do that. Many of the large school districts don't have a unit that focuses on students. They have one, parents and teachers, but not one for their largest stakeholder. And I think if we really respectfully listen to our students, engage them in our work, turn it over to them, that many of our academic achievement will improve, and many of the things that we are struggling with, they will help us with. Just like the group that we brought here that's doing the Aspen Challenge. So I ask you to engage that. It's very difficult for me to find other districts that have that, so we can compare our work and engage our students and get them to help us with our work.
Great recommendation. The foundations did a parallel report to the one that we put out. And they had hired a group called Policy Link to do analysis of communities that had actually been successful with their place-based work around not just boys and men of color, but vulnerable populations in general. And one of the big findings was that, one, young people want to be involved in solving their own problems. No surprise there. Two, that in fact that is an essential component of the work, that it changes self-efficacy. And so it also changes the way the work gets done.
Hi, thanks. My name is Sylvia. Thank you for speaking with us today. I had a question about if you could just speak to how the task force is thinking about working with local governments. Yeah. Specifically, since it's the local government human services systems that are really have the most scalable impact and, of course, the most financial stress on resources. Yeah. And then with that, those systems partner very heavily with nonprofits, but knowing that nonprofits can't be responsible for meeting the scale issue. So could you kind of talk to thoughts, plans to address that?
No, I appreciate you bringing it. So again, I mentioned earlier that the work of really on the ground, improving the outcomes for young people is local work. The role of mayors and superintendents in this can't be understated. And the connectivity that needs to happen between the various agencies in a community in order to address these issues is something that you ignore at your own peril. Frankly, it's what we've done, which is why we've not seen progress. The lack of recognition, and this is in the report that we said, that the lack of recognition between the connection between the criminal justice systems, the health systems, and the education system, as well as those things, that lack of recognition and then building systems to actually bring them together is part of the reason we've not seen progress. So what we're trying to do is to identify communities that we're working with, and luckily we've been doing this work already, to identify communities where they're trying to bridge those gaps, to get nonprofits also to get in to hold some external accountability around that integration. And then for what we can do at the federal level is both provide incentives and waivers to make it easier to do that work. But the most important thing is we find mayors who actually care enough and are willing to take on the political heat that comes when you break down systems, take money from one place and move it or make it fungible to go somewhere else. And then the last piece of it is are willing to be both vulnerable enough and strong enough to invite community in to the solution so that they can get leverage from the resources they're putting out. I'll end on this, I know it's a long answer, I'm sorry. The thing that I like about where we're going now is, like, it doesn't matter if you're doing this for a moral reason or whether you how much we spend on certain expenses like prisons or whatever the case might be. The economic future of our country, the Council on Education put out a report that basically said the biggest inhibitor of growth right now is the fact that our undeveloped populations have a significant lag. If we actually stimulate their development, we will actually double our growth rate. So all that to say that it doesn't matter why you want to see it happen. If our mayors and our superintendents will open themselves up to true partnership with the local community providers and then break down the barriers between their systems, we will see jumps in performance. Sir.
Thank you very much for bringing this to us today. I'm my name is Nathan. I'm the director of the ACLU of Colorado, and both at our state level and then at the national ACLU, a lot of these issues are a very big part of. I mean, particularly the things related to criminal justice reform, and in fact, the report you mentioned on marijuana arrest rates, that was an ACLU report last year. We just had a report nationally that came out on the militarization of police, and it once again shows the racial disparities in how policing occurs. And we actually have a report coming out fairly soon that's going to be on private prisons and the role of them. There's a lot of pieces of criminal justice reform as well as voting rights and other things that we're doing here in Colorado. But my question for you is, where are the points of synergy? What would you like to see groups like the ACLU doing, and how do we find synergy with what you're doing so that it's not just parallel but isolated work?
So this comes back to what people can do. So clearly a lot of this is about advocacy. Actually, in certain cases, it's legal work. There are things that we can do to create the broad context for the kinds of changes we need to see in the system. Some people will voluntarily make those changes. Others will need to be compelled. And so folks like you guys, where you see injustice, where you see disparity, compelling folks to do the right thing, oftentimes bring them to the table for solutions that actually, once they get into them, they realize had broader benefit in the first place. So for the folks of you who are involved in advocacy in a whole variety of ways, really understanding where these disparities are and where the leverage points are based on what works, there's a huge opportunity there. The second group I'll talk to are folks who are actually philanthropists. And everybody tends to think about like the big philanthropists that make the multi-million-dollar grants across cities and states and things like that. But in every community, there are schools that are trying to fill certain gaps, that are trying to address the needs of students that are hard to meet with the way our systems are set up today. So you can either, if you have a little bit more resources, help to try and build the systems that allow for this integration that we talked about, or as the system is making that transition, you can actually help with the gap fill, bringing in the resources in from the outside to help address a health need in a school or a mental health need in a school or whatever the case might be. Or supporting mentors who go in and work with other young people. There are lots of ways to do that. This guy who decided to do the glasses thing in Los Angeles, once he got it going, it's like $500,000 a band. He's finding people who want to do that every day.
Wow.
And then the last thing I'll say is, lots of emphasis in the mentoring thing is going to be on finding male mentors and male mentors of color. I want to tell you, young people, boys of color, want to be loved and respected. And it doesn't matter what color you are. It does not matter what color you are. And so if you care enough to want to touch a young person's life, get in there and do it. They will love you, and you will never regret the experience.
Yeah. We've got, go ahead. Good.
My question is, could you explain the process or the steps from after you do the listening hearings? How does that trickle down to the organizations that's going to be implementing the services?
So what we're now doing is transitioning from these listening sessions to actually trying to turn them into sessions that are mechanisms for galvanizing local community action. What that will mean is that a lot of times we'll either go to a new community or we'll go back to where we went before, identifying the folks who have already people are self-identifying that they want to be engaged in this work. And in most cases, we're trying to find some anchor institutions to work with that can carry the work when we're not there. What typically happens in that context is they use those forums to then set up what they call a broad table, usually across multiple sectors. And so an anchor institution in some cases might be a university that says that it's willing to bring everybody together. It might be a public housing authority that says that it wants to play a significant role. In many cases, it's a local nonprofit that's been working in a particular neighborhood. And now more and more we're finding that mayors' offices themselves United Ways, and other organizations that have broad reach are starting to play those roles as well. So just somebody who has the heft, and in some cases actually even local community foundations and others are doing it, but they have the heft to bring people to the table, the resources to staff it, because it takes work to help people coordinate, and that can access, if they don't have the analytical work, to keep the data and evidence out in front. Then what happens is they create these tables where they bring everybody together, nonprofits, whoever, and start to identify what people are willing to do to help move the needle on those outcomes. What winds up happening in that context is some people are able to step forward and say, we clearly can show you that what we've been doing works, and we have lots of data to show it, and we've got lots of stories to tell you about what's happened. Some people don't have that. It's easier to find out what you do with the people who have the data already and have the good stories, because people are anxious to put resources behind them. For the other folks, what we're trying to help communities do is find easier ways for those folks that have been doing, like I'll call it, real local grassroots without a lot of support work, to be able to tell their story in a way that gets them access to resources too.
Got a wrap? Are we having
decisions where the resources go?
So usually that is controlled, that's all controlled locally once those backbone institutions are set up and whatever the funding mechanisms are.
Okay, 2 minutes. Any more questions? Yeah, oh, go ahead.
Yeah. So, thank you for this. This has been really informative. My question there really sort of two parts. In laying out your argument, Peter, or laying out your questions, you talked specifically about the technical challenges, right? With the economy, for example.
Yeah.
So we know that when we talk about solutions, there's a role that the corporate sector can play. So if you could talk.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'll start over. So in framing some of your questions to Jim, you talked about the technical challenge that we have and real solutions that these young people need in order to do this reconnection. And so if you could talk a little bit about the role of the corporate sector in solutions, I think that would be really good on the technical side. But the other challenge here that you also were asking about is the adaptive challenge, right? And so if you could speak a little bit to...
What do you mean by the adaptive challenge?
So how do we change the public narrative? You said in your listening sessions you heard of these young men, right?
Yep.
So that, if you could speak to that public narrative as well, that would be great.
Yeah. So the corporate sector, I mean, there are myriad ways for them to play, and I get more and more excited every day. So this thing about the effective use of data to actually drive more focused work in communities, and how you actually then allow these different agencies to connect their resources and the data that they have to serve communities better, it's a big deal. Like, there's so much inefficiency that comes from not being able to do that well. And so we're finding companies that want to jump in and help do that kind of work and help community figure out how they use the data to do that. And that sounds kind of wonky, but it actually matters a lot. The second thing is they're huge platforms for expertise, and they're huge platforms for employment. Whether you're big or small, being able to provide somebody a job, you know, the Secretary of Education, he'll be here tomorrow. He, in a room of talking about this, will say jobs, 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 jobs. Like, I talked a lot about the education stuff. He will say jobs, like creating a real opportunity for somebody to be able to support themselves and then ultimately support their families. That's how you stop the cycle.
Jobs and wages.
And jobs and wages. I mean, and that's what I said. This has to be a job that not only allows you to take care of yourself and ultimately someone else, it also needs a path to something else. And then the last thing is these platforms. You know, this thing we saw Starbucks do just recently, right? Where they said, look, we know we have a bunch of people who we won't be able to create tremendous opportunity for within our corporation, but they're going to spend their time with us. We're going to invest in them to be able to create new pathways for themselves. They'll stay with us a little bit longer, which will be great for us, but then they'll be able to have a better opportunity than we're done. My bet is we're going to see the corporations doing a lot more of that and turning their supply chains and other things into vehicles for real opportunity for people. Good deal?
Question. Great questions. Thank you all for joining us. Really appreciate it. And thank you, Jim. One more round of applause for Jim Shelton.